We will be talking about chapter 6 now, and chapter 6 is a little bit of some things that we've already talked about, which is really nice. We've had a lab about blood typing already, so we're going to have a little bit more in-depth discussion about that, okay? Technically, it's called the cardiovascular system, like subtitled blood. Okay, so we're talking more specifically about blood, which goes along with chapter 5. It goes along with our, I hope I'm getting a phone call. How do I turn it off? That was weird. It goes along with chapter 5, talking about the cardiovascular system. It goes along with the surface area to volume ratio and talking about why we have, the concave shape of the red blood cell. All these things are kind of tying together here just to specifically talk more about blood. Okay. Now this is a long points to ponder slide, but it says a lot of the same things over and over essentially. So it says what type of tissue is blood and what are the components? We know that it's a connective tissue. It's fluid connective tissue, if you remember those. We're going to talk about what's found in the plasma. Like when you go donate plasma, what are you actually giving? Name the 3 formed elements in the blood, and we know those already too. The red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets. How does the structure of red blood cells relate to their function? So essentially, the structure meaning their shape and what they do and how that kind of works together. We're going to describe the structure and function of a white blood cell. We're going to talk about a few disorders of the blood, what you need to know before donating blood. And then the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, essentially, bullet points are stuff we talked about in lab. So you'll be able to kind of revisit those ideas of like, what are antigens and antibodies? How is ABO blood types determined, which we kind of did that already. What blood types are compatible for blood transfusions? We're going to talk about the Rh factor and why it's important to pregnancy. And then also, how does the cardiovascular system interact with other systems to maintain homeostasis? Homeostasis is one of our buzzwords up here. Remember, our body wants to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. Your body is constantly adapting and changing to the environment that it goes in because it just wants to pump blood and put oxygen to your extremities. That's your main goal. So if you go outside today and it's freezing cold, you maybe tense up, or you're going to wear a jacket, or you're going to start to shiver. That's your body trying to maintain homeostasis. But homeostasis is more than just body temperature. It's also about like your fluid intake and things like that, maintaining that fluid intake, maintaining your energy sources. So even when you go, you got stranded in the desert and you go 2 days without food, your body just doesn't shut down immediately. It does maintain homeostasis for a certain amount of time, but not forever. Okay, what are the functions of the blood? So the functions of the blood, we want to use it to transport nutrients such as oxygen and, let's see here. I'm going to get this pulled up on the Zoom here. We want to transport oxygen and nutrients. Okay, so when you had lunch, hopefully you had lunch, or you're going to after this, you ate, you guys all ate super healthy. I'm sure you did, right? I had a grilled cheese sandwich, so healthy as you may. Those nutrients, we want them to fuel our muscles. We want them to fuel your brain. Those nutrients, your vitamin A, B, C, all of those things, vitamin D that you could eat in your food, your blood is going to transport those to the rest of your body. It also gets rid of your waste and your carbon dioxide. So when you're breathing out carbon dioxide, it first came through your blood system and then into the lungs, to the respiratory system, and out your mouth or your nose for when you're breathing. And also hormones. Hormones are like estrogen, testosterone, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin. All of those different hormones are actually transported throughout your body in the blood system. So the first function of that blood is transportation, all right? It's kind of like a train track. Defense, okay? It also helps with the invasion of pathogens. Pathogens can be like a virus or a bacteria, okay? You've probably had things in your body that your blood or your white blood cells has fought off without you even having a single symptom, okay? This is because our blood helps against the fight of those pathogens. For example, you could get like somebody saying they're immune to COVID or the flu because you've had it. What essentially that could mean is that your body just knows how to fight it off. It doesn't mean that you just won't get it. It just your body knows how to fight it off. It won't have maybe as intense symptoms as it would if you would have gotten it initially. It also helps with regulatory functions, meaning like how do we regulate our body and maintain the functions that we need in order to live and survive. And that would be body temperature, that water-salt balance, and your body's pH. Okay, we want to maintain this certain amount of efficiency in our body so that we can continue to, pump blood, breathe oxygen, break down nutrients for fuel, and things like that. The blood is made up of formed elements. Those formed elements are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. They are produced in the red bone marrow, and we talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. So essentially inside of your bone, in your compact bone, you have red bone marrow, and that is where these formed elements are created. Your red blood cells, they've also been called erythrocytes. White blood cells are also called leukocytes, and your platelets or your thrombocytes. We'll talk about each of those a little bit more specifically here in a couple of slides. Your plasma, like when someone goes to donate plasma, it consists of 91% water and 9% salts and other organic molecules. And the plasma proteins are the most abundant organic molecules. Your plasma, so it's made up of like water and protein, like it says. So if somebody were to go donate plasma, usually before and after they go, they're drinking a lot of fluids, they're eating a high protein diet, such as like, lots of nuts, like almonds, a turkey sandwich, whatever it may be. Okay, making sure they get enough protein and water because that's where a lot of our protein and water is held in our body. The plasma can also help with the fight off of diseases and things like that, and not diseases, but pathogens in our body. So usually someone who needs to receive plasma either has like an immunodeficiency disease where they can't produce their own plasma, or they're not producing enough of their own protein, even if they're eating a high protein diet, things like that. Their body's just not able to fight things off as well as someone who doesn't need to receive plasma.
Question.
Yes.
So like when they like take your blood, is it possible to like separate the plasma from the blood you give? Okay.
It is. So I've donated plasma before, and it's cool to kind of watch. Maybe not for everybody, but because I'm a scientist, I think it's kind of cool. They actually centrifuge it in that machine right next to you if you've ever donated plasma before. So the blood comes out of the tube, right? Like just like you're donating donating blood, and then in the machine they centrifuge it. And a centrifuge is, if you've ever been to like Adventureland in Iowa, there's an amusement park near Des Moines. I don't even know if they have that ride anymore, but silly silo. Yeah, you turn on that silly silo and that thing spins around really fast and it shoves everybody else up against the wall because it's going so fast. Essentially, you're the blood, right? They put it in this really fast spinning machine, right? And because the plasma is less dense than the red blood cells, they'll separate, okay? So I also think about it like if I were to spin around really fast, have you ever done that before? And then the blood in your fingers kind of rushes to your fingers and it kind of feels weird when you go really fast. That's essentially what's happening in that centrifuge. Spinning it really fast to separate the blood and the plasma, and then they just take the plasma off the top and give you your red blood cells back. And that's what essentially is happening when you donate plasma. Yeah. I thought that was weird at first that they give you your red blood cells back. I'm like, you might as well donate that too, but maybe that's a long day, a lot of donating. Okay, there are 3 major types of plasma proteins. So these are just proteins. Remember, proteins are a macromolecule. They help with a lot of functions in the body. These are the types of proteins that are found in the plasma. The albumins, the globulins, and the fibrinogen, which is kind of hard to say with a mask on. The first one is the most abundant and important for the plasma's osmotic pressure as well as transport. The word osmotic pressure, it's in red. It just means like the pressure of water that's in your blood cells and in your blood vessels that helps with the gas exchange. So when the pressure changes, it's allowing different molecules to leave the capillaries and things like that. The globulins are also important for transporting things, nutrients, oxygen, etc. And then important for the formation of blood clots is the fibrinogen. So hard to say with a mask on. Formation of blood clots is important for when you have a paper cut on your finger, or you scrape your knee on the sidewalk and you're bleeding. Your body doesn't want to lose that much blood, so your body can recognize when the pressure changes, and it sends some platelets, but also this protein called fibrinogen that's going to help clot that blood in that area, kind of like a Band-Aid made by your body. So this slide is explaining where these formed elements come from and what are they. So you have stem cells that are in your bones and in your bone marrow, and the stem cells make different types of white blood cells. And these white blood cells are what these look like right here. Okay, some of these white blood cells, they become more specific white blood cells, but other of these stem cells turn into red blood cells and platelets. So remember, the three formed elements are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. This one is called erythroblasts or erythrocytes. Red blood cells help transport your oxygen and carbon dioxide, so oxygen to your extremities, and then exhaling and get rid of carbon dioxide. These are your specific white blood cells. They're different because of their nucleus on the inside. This one is circular, that's a lymphocyte. This is a monocyte, it kind of looks like a lima bean. A neutrophil kind of looks like a bulb with like a long skinny part. And then an eosinophil kind of looks like the letter C. And a basophil has these granules in it. You guys don't need to remember the different types of white blood cells. Just know that they do different things, that there are different types of white blood cells. And then you have platelets. And platelets help in the aid of blood clotting. Remember, blood clotting is important for when you have a scrape on your arm or things like that. But blood clots are not always good, because if you have a blood clot in your leg and it wasn't because you were bleeding, it can cut off some oxygen pathways to your heart, etc. So the question at the beginning on that Points to Ponder page asks why the structure and the function are related and important to red blood cells. Their structure, essentially, they don't have a nucleus. They do not have organelles. So they don't have a mitochondria. They don't have a Golgi apparatus or an endoplasmic reticulum. They have a bioconcave shape. So they kind of look like a frisbee. So red blood cells, RBC, they're kind of this frisbee shape, but they also have this bioconcave shape. So it kind of looks like somebody had like a thumb and they pressed in the middle of it. Okay, this is supposedly to help increase the surface area to volume ratio. Right? It allows for our red blood cells to effectively transport oxygen to our extremities. It says each red blood cell contains about 280 million hemoglobin molecules that bind 3 molecules of oxygen to each of them. And to take it even a step further, iron, the molecule iron, helps bind the oxygen to those hemoglobin molecules. So when someone is iron deficient or anemic, that means that they are lacking in the attachment of oxygen to those red blood cells. It doesn't mean that there's no oxygen present, it's just less oxygen is present. That's why somebody who's anemic or iron deficient may start to feel a little dizzy, or they may have that like kind of in and out of the blacking of your eyes, maybe out of breath. right? And then so the red blood cells, like I said, they have this kind of pressed little look into them. They kind of remind me of those cookies that you put the little Hershey's Kiss on top of when you press it in. They're that bioconcave shape. All right, here is a hemoglobin molecule, the helical shape of the polypeptide molecule. All right, and then these are called the little heme group, and that's also bound by iron. It's really hard to see in this, but the hemoglobin group is like this little disc, and then this is iron in here, and that's just where the molecules of oxygen attach to help get the blood and oxygen to our extremities. Here, this last picture is a capillary. Remember, capillaries are good for gas exchange. It's how we get the oxygen from our blood to our lungs and vice versa, right? Because when you think of oxygen, you think of like a gas, right? You can see your breath when you go outside. It's not very inviting, but it happens, right? You can see your breath when you go outside, but your blood is liquid. So how does that, kind of work itself out? It's the capillaries. You can see that some of the blood here is kind of built up. That's because it's moving in and out due to the osmotic pressure, how the pressure changes. Think of like that little toy I talked about with the glitter on the inside. When you squeeze one side, it gets a little bit more dense on the other. And when you squeeze the other side, it moves that liquid across. That's kind of what's happening here, but with the exchange of liquid and gases. In order to get the oxygen out where it needs to, get the carbon dioxide in and out. And this is all happening very rapidly. This is talking about how carbon dioxide is transported. So there's carbon dioxide in your body, and it's in different forms. The first one, it says 68 is transported as a bicarbonate ion in the plasma. This conversion takes place in red blood cells. So a bicarbonate ion means that it's charged. This is what a bicarbonate ion looks like over here on the slide, okay? That's 68% of where our carbon dioxide is in our body. So that's the most of it. About 25% of your carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells, and about 7% of that carbon dioxide is found in the plasma. So this is just saying, where's our carbon dioxide? How is it transported throughout the body? You don't need to worry about the specific percentages or anything like that. But we do need to focus on how we make red blood cells. This is important because, well, red blood cells, we just talked about how important they are. We just want to know how it's made. They're produced in the red bone marrow, and I have a picture on the next slide that'll show that a little bit more specifically. They have a lifespan of about 120 days, but remember, it's not like all of your red blood cells were created on the same day at the same time. So it's not like 120 days later you just get rid of all your red blood cells and then they all come back on the same day. It's at a gradual give and take stage throughout your life and throughout your day even, okay? It's good that we kind of get new blood cells and new red blood cells for the purpose of efficiency, helping to detoxify your body from any toxins, pathogens, things like that. Erythropoietin, EPO, is secreted by kidney cells and moves the red bone marrow when oxygen levels are low. Okay, so this happens when, something as drastic as like actual low oxygen levels. So think of like an astronaut maybe, where there's low oxygen, but also something as simple as like working out. You've been working out for too long. So it's kind of, this one's a little tricky, this little bullet point here. Just know that there's things in our kidney cells that move to that red bone marrow when oxygen levels are low to help us continue to produce red blood cells, okay? Your old blood cells are destroyed by your liver and your spleen, which we talked about. Like your liver helps detoxify your body, so it helps destroy those old red blood cells. So here's an example of the production of the red blood cells. So what happens is your body will recognize that there's low levels of oxygen in the blood. Okay, but this isn't something that happens immediately. but it also doesn't happen over a long period of time either. So what happens is your kidney increases the production of that erythropoietin. Here's that picture right here I wanted to show you of the stem cells and how they're in the red bone marrow. This is a picture of a bone. Here's that spongy part of your bone up here that we've talked about. There's a lot of holes for impact for when you're walking, or like this one probably looks like your humerus. And then in here in your compact bone is the red bone marrow, and that's where the red blood cells are produced. You can see a lot of veins and arteries that come through your bone here. And then we have the oxygen levels in the blood that returns to normal, because when we produce more red blood cells, we're able to essentially transport more oxygen, right? It's like if we got 10 more UPS drivers in each city across the United States, then all of a sudden we can deliver more packages faster. But that seems simple, right? Let's just all produce way more blood than we need and we'll just become elite athletes, right? So what is blood doping? Well, somebody who blood dopes, which is illegal in most professional and amateur sports, is when there's a method of increasing the number of red blood cells to help your athletic performance. Now, I like to work out. I probably am not as in shape as insert an athlete that you like here, like Serena Williams or something. She's probably way more athletic than me, right? But if I were to just, go make some more red blood cells, I could transport way more oxygen to my extremities. I could work out for longer. I could build more muscle, right? This seems like a good idea in theory. But what happens is now that it's allowing for more efficient delivery of oxygen and it reduces the fatigue, meaning I can work out for longer, it's thought to also cause death to the thickening of the blood, and it leads to a heart attack. Okay, so what happens is there's a couple of ways. One, that EPO protein that we talked about in this previous slide here that's secreted from your kidneys, they give that protein to the person months before that event that they are thinking of. Can anybody think of an athlete who has done this?
Lance Armstrong.
Lance Armstrong. Was that who you were thinking, Tyler?
Well, I was going to say like some of the Russian athletes at the Olympics.
Yeah. Lance Armstrong was the one I was thinking of too. I'm sure that it's happened in other athletics as well. Okay, so a couple months before the Tour de France, was it the Tour de France that he got caught at? One of his races, yeah. They give him this EPO protein, and his body's going, you don't have enough oxygen in your blood, even though he totally does, right? He's an elite athlete. He could go bike for 6 hours and make it look like a walk in the park, right? This is even before the blood doping. Anyway, so you give him this protein a couple months before the Tour de France. His body's like, oh, I must need to produce more red blood cells. It produces more red blood cells, in theory, right? More oxygen transported to your extremities, less fatigue, really cool. But what's happening is now your heart is having to work harder because you have more blood in the blood vessels. So think of the water park example. They usually make one person in a tube go down at one time. Now grab 10 of your friends and go down that same water slide. You're probably going to get caught, right? You're going to get kind of maybe stuck, or it's going to take a little bit longer for you to get down the water slide. That's essentially what's happening here. So there's thickening of the blood, and it can lead to a heart attack because of that, because maybe the thickening could end up being a little bit more clotted. It can't, get through some blood vessels as fast and things like that. So yes, this is illegal, I think, in all professional sports and amateur sports because of the risk of death. So whoever thought of it, in theory, probably a good idea, but in reality, not so much. Some disorders of the red blood cells. So anemia is the one I've been talking about kind of frequently. I think that's one that people run into a little bit more. Maybe, have a friend or somebody who's anemic. This is a condition resulting from too few red blood cells or too little hemoglobin that causes a run-down feeling. You're just tired. You're out of breath. Maybe you're having that like fading in and out of your eyes. That's anemic. And like I said, it sometimes happens more frequently in people who have menstrual cycles because of the excess blood that is being expelled from the body. Sickle cell anemia is another type of disorder of the red blood cells. And what sickle cell anemia is, it's kind of like anemia, but it's because of the shape of the red blood cell. Sickle cell anemia. Just going to abbreviate because I don't have time to write it out. It's kind of where we get this like raisin-like shape of the red blood cell. The shape, remember, we talked a couple of slides ago, is really important for the efficiency. So now when we kind of have this weird shape, kind of looks like a little bit of a grape, shriveled up, it causes the red blood cell, like it says, to be sickled shape, and it's prone to being ruptured. It also doesn't allow for the transport of oxygen as effectively as a red blood cell that looks like this. It's a genetic disease. It can be inherited. We talk about sickle cell anemia more in the genetics chapter, in genetic inheritance, but know, as we move forward, that if somebody is a carrier, so if you have sickle cell anemia, it's a recessive trait, and we'll talk about like dominant and recessive traits. So if you have sickle cell anemia, you have 2 small letters. If you do not have sickle cell anemia, so this is what it looks like to have it, do not have it, you are a dominant trait, which means you have big letters. But if you look like this, you can have a resistance to malaria. Well, that seems like a good gig, right? I don't have sickle cell anemia and I don't have malaria. That sounds like a good day, right? So when you look like that, it's a resistance to malaria. But what then happens is if you and your partner get together and you both have the genetics, both of you don't have malaria. That's great. Both of you don't have sickle cell anemia. When you cross you and the partner, I say you as the hypothetical person, not just you, it's still possible for your child to have sickle cell anemia, and that's why it's still around. It's because there's a benefit of being resistant to malaria, and even though these 2 people don't have malaria and they don't have sickle cell anemia, it's still possible for them to carry the genetic trait to have sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is also, like if you're an NCAA athlete, they ask you if you'd like to get tested for it when you show up to campus. Has anybody been asked that before? Will, have you been asked if you wanted to get tested for sickle cell anemia?
I'm pretty sure I have actually. Yeah.
You've been tested?
I haven't been tested.
But they asked you? Yeah. And so usually it kind of shows up in the early 20s, which is like a college athlete. And you can also find out you have sickle cell anemia from overexertion. So when somebody is just like overexerted, then they'll just like pass out. But like usually that person can just like walk around day to day and not know your body's working really hard. But it also can cause a lot of difficulties as it progresses. The last one there is hemolytic disease of a newborn. This is a condition when it has an incompatible blood type that leads to rupturing of blood cells in the baby before and continuing after birth. This just means that mom and baby don't have the same blood type. And we talked about that, right? We said, well, when you have blood transfusions, somebody who is B positive can't receive A negative. I guess they couldn't receive A negative. And so what happens if mom and baby are 2 different blood types, and how does that look? Okay. Luckily, we have some good technology and some Western medicine that helps us with that a little bit. So let's move on to white blood cells. White blood cells, they're also derived from that red bone marrow, so like in the compact part of your bone. The large blood cells, these large blood cells have a nucleus, which if you remember from a couple of slides ago, I was describing the nuclei as round or lima bean shape, or they're kind of bubbly kind of looking. Remember, the red blood cells don't have a nucleus. So if the question said, compare a red blood cell to a white blood cell, one of the things would be that, well, white blood cells have a nucleus and red blood cells do not. But they are both derived in the red bone marrow. The production is regulated by a colony stimulating factor, and they can be found in the tissues as well as the blood. One of the tissues that it can be found in is the lymph. If you remember the fluid connective tissue lymph, like your lymph nodes, which when you get sick, your lymph nodes kind of swell up a little bit with excess fluid. It can help fight off infection, which is an important part of the immune system. So when you are immune to something, that just means your immune system kind of knows what it's talking about. It knows how to fight it off. It's done this before. Kind of like if you're a senior and you came back to Wartburg, you're like, I know what I'm doing now. I've been here for 3 years. I know where the dining hall is. I'm not going to get lost. Some live for only days, while others live for months or years. White blood cells are complicated. Like I said, we don't need to memorize the different types. Just kind of know they're important for fighting off infections and pathogens. They have a nucleus. They help your immune system. That's kind of what they are important for. If you want to know what white blood cells look like, again, there's that slide. Here's the picture from your book, figure 6.5. Some examples of those white blood cells. The way you can tell the difference between white blood cells are their nuclei, like the nucleus, and if they have any granules. Granules are these little dots that look like chicken pox. Don't worry, you all have them, and those are not chicken pox. They just look like little red dots. So like I said, the way we categorize the white blood cells are the granules, or those little dots, or if they do not have dots, and the type of nuclei they have. So these ones up here have the dots, they have those granules, and they have a lobed nuclei. The bottom ones don't have any of those dots, and they kind of have either a round or just like a big single nuclei. Just knowing how to characterize those. Excuse me. The first one is called a neutrophil. It's made up of 50 to 70% of all white blood cells, so this is mainly the most common one. When I teach at Hawkeye, they are asked to look at a microscope and look at a pre-prepared slide under a microscope, right? So you're zooming in, you're looking at this really close, and there's some blood on this slide. And they get a look at all the little red blood cells, and they look like a whole bunch of dots like this. And then, in that same blood cell, they have, I'm going to put them as little stars, they have some white blood cells. And they're more sporadic. You have more red blood cells in your body than you do white blood cells, okay? And then each of these white blood cells in this little small sample are possibly all different. But if you were to count how many of these were neutrophils, you'd probably guess that like 7 out of 10 that you counted would be neutrophils. They're the most common, okay? They have a multi-lobed nucleus. When you have some sort of infection in your body, they move out of circulation. So it's kind of like calling in a superhero or putting like the Batman thing in the sky, right? As soon as there's a infection, they move out of what they were normally doing and they engulf those pathogens, which is kind of cool. So they're like your body's superheroes. Okay, the eosinophils, these are pretty rare. There's a small percentage of them. They have a bilobed nucleus, meaning that they just have 2 lobes. It can kind of look like the letter C or a lima bean kind of. They have many large granules, so they have a whole bunch of dots on them. And their function is in parasitic infections, and they also play a role in allergies. I have seasonal allergies. I'm allergic to grass and pollen and all of those things. So while I'm looking forward to the warm weather, I'm not looking forward to my allergies, but hopefully my eosinophils will help me combat those allergies. Mine are not as drastic as some other people's may be, like somebody may be allergic to like peanuts or like seafood. Yeah.
Cause like, does the severity of your allergy have something to do with the amount of eosinophils, or does that do something else?
It depends on the type of allergy. So like food allergies are different than like pollen allergies. It's dependent on how it's intaken into your body. So like if you're allergic to dogs and cats, or like the fur of dogs and cats, like most likely what's happening is you get the fur on your hands and then you like scratch your eyes and then like gives you some sort of reaction. Somebody who's allergic to peanuts like eats a peanut butter sandwich, God forbid, and you know has some sort of reaction like that. So one, the severity depends on how it was put into your body. The amount of eosinophils doesn't matter as much just because it's such a small percentage in your body. So it's not saying that if you go get some more eosinophils, it'll combat your allergies. If that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So it has a little bit to do with how it's intake into your body. So like pollen can just be in the air. So like if somebody's walking outside and you just breathe it in. Things like that. That depends on the severity. A basophil, also a small percentage. These also release histamines to help with allergic reactions. So a histamine, now take note, I'm not saying antihistamine, I'm just saying histamine. Histamine would be where your body would send some excess fluid to help fight off whatever this allergic reaction is happening. It might induce some swelling. So if I'm having an allergic reaction to some grass, my eyes might get kind of watery, my nose might get kind of runny, things like that. That's histamines in my body fighting off what my body doesn't like. So what you do usually to combat that is you go and take a Zyrtec or a Claritin D, and those are antihistamines. And an antihistamine essentially reduces swelling, reduces your itchy, watery eyes, helps with your runny nose. It only helps with the symptoms. It doesn't cure your allergy, right? Good. So that's kind of an interesting one. Your body wants to send histamines to help fight off that allergy, and then you're going to be like, nope, I'm going to give you an antihistamine. I don't want a runny nose right now. All right. A lymphocyte, these are also fairly common. They're probably second to the neutrophils. These have a large nucleus that takes up most of the cytoplasm, so it kind of looks like a big cookie on the inside. And they develop into B and T cells that are important in the immune system. When I see the word T cells, I think of HIV and how if somebody has HIV, it attacks their helper T cells. And then once you have less helper T cells, you get sick more frequently, which then leads that person, once their T cell count gets to a low count, meaning the amount of T cells are in their body, that's when somebody is diagnosed with AIDS. So it starts out as HIV, your helper T cells get pretty much attacked. And then if you don't have helper T cells, you're not able to fight off infections as well. And as that T cell count decreases, after I think it's below 200 or 150 T cells per volume or something, that's when somebody's diagnosed with AIDS. And it's important for the immune system. So lymphocytes have to do with that. And then last type of white blood cell is a monocyte. Again, these are also relatively uncommon. The two most common ones are lymphocyte and nucleophil. This is the largest white blood cell, and they have a horseshoe-shaped nucleus, or like a letter C. They take residence in tissues and develop into macrophages that are used to just engulf pathogens. So think of like an infection in your body, like influenza B, your monocytes are going to come and try and eat it, like Pac-Man. All right. So it says, how does blood leave their circulation? We talked about the capillaries. The capillaries kind of move these white blood cells through these little kind of, I don't know if I want to call them openings, but kind of these cracks in your blood capillary, and then the white blood cell will then leave through the capillaries. If you remember the capillaries, it goes arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and then back to your heart. That cycle we put on the board last week. Your capillaries are that gas exchange. It's also where your blood cells leave circulation to go help in a certain area. Okay, some disorders of white blood cells. The one in the middle seems to be fairly common. That's leukemia. It's where it's a different type where there's a group of cancers that affect the white blood cells, which the cells can proliferate without control. So you have cells in your body, and a lot of them, except for like your nerve cells, they kind of turn over and you get new cells, such as like your skin cells. You'll get new skin cells every 2 weeks. Your kidney cells, your liver cells, they're regenerating and getting new cells all the time. They're going through mitosis, and you're getting rid of the excess and old cells. Same with your red blood cells. But if those cells are just kind of dying without control, or bursting essentially, that's what proliferate means. It just means that your body's not recovering as well from them turning over like that. So that's leukemia. There's a severe combined immunodeficiency disease, SCID. Anybody remember what movie SCID was in, or a book? It was a good book. Yeah.
Is it the little boy in the bubble? Is that
Close.
that guy?
Yes, I think. Well, I'm thinking the movie has a girl in it, and the mom. I don't want to spoil
Oh,
it.
is it like everything?
Yes, it is. Everything. Is there another one where there's a boy in a bubble that has
Well, there's like
SCID?
a really old one, like my parents' age,
Yeah.
when John Travolta was young, and
Okay.
the boys in the bubble,
Oh,
he
it
has that.
could be. It sounds correct. It's where essentially that it's an inherited disease where they lack the stem cells that make the white blood cells and the enzyme, so they can't fight off infection. So in everything, it's a good book. I read the book first before the movie came out. Fun fact. Essentially, the premise of the story is the girl has SCIDs and doesn't go out in the real world, because if you go out, like, think about it, how often we're exposed to everything since you were a small child, and just the amount that your body is constantly fighting off, their body can't do that. I won't give any spoilers. Okay. Also, the last one is called infectious mononucleosis. If you've ever heard of just mono, that's what the last one is. Okay. Also known as the kissing disease. It's just kind of a myth that, yeah, the kissing disease. So it's like if you kiss somebody who has mono, then you get mono. That's why it's called the kissing disease. It occurs when the virus infects your lymphocytes, and it results in fatigue, sore throat, swollen lymph nodes. I actually had mono when I was in 2nd grade. It took me out of school for 2 weeks. And I didn't get out of bed. It also really affected, have you had an experience?
2 months last year.
Oh yeah, 2 months. It probably affects people when they're different ages too. When I was in 2nd grade, so I remember very specific moments. I remember trying to get out of bed and my muscles, the fatigue, I couldn't hold myself up. Yeah, so it can really take you out of the game there for a little bit. So that last one is maybe just known as mono, if you've heard of that one. Platelets. So we talked about red blood cells. We talked about white blood cells. Now we're going to talk about platelets. This is the third formed element in the thing that we call blood. Most of the time when you say blood, people just think of the red blood cells in it, right? Because your blood is red or purplish blue or whatever color it may be. And there are, all these different elements to it, like the white blood cells. And now we have these platelets. And there's a lot of itty bitty platelets in your body and in your blood specifically. There are 200 billion platelets made per day. Okay, that's such a big number that you actually can't conceptualize how big that number is. Okay, that's a lot. They help with blood clotting, which is important. And I'll show a picture on the next slide here that'll be fairly descriptive of that. Blood proteins, such as the thrombin and the fibrinogen, create clots by forming fibrin threads that catch the red blood cells. So essentially these platelets kind of make like a basketball net, and they go like this, and they're like, stop, red blood cells, don't come out of the skin. So what that looks like is kind of like this. So we have, this is such a really graphic picture here. I apologize. There's like a knife sticking to this, or what do you guys think that is? Like a staple, a nail? I have no idea what that is. Anyways, a blood vessel is punctured. All right. What happens then is these little light blue things that are floating around called platelets, they congregate and form a plug right here. They use those proteins that we talked about here, and platelets in the damaged tissue cells release those proteins, and then the fibrin threads form and trap the red blood cells. I also think of like the game Red Rover, if you ever played that in PE, where you're like all hold hands and you try to like not let your friend run through the two hands. This is a tangent, but one time in my school, we had he's an All-American wrestler who went to Iowa, and we have like another D1 wrestler who went to UNI, and they were like in this line, right? These are like some strong kids, right? And then they like, this one girl tried to run through them. I'm like, why did you pick them? You know, you always pick the person who's not that strong to try and run through their arms, right? And she like totally got clotheslined. I just think about that, just whew. I can still see it, bless you. So essentially this is like Red Rover, right? They're all kind of holding hands, they're joining these threads, they're not letting that red blood cell escape, made up of fibrin threads. You guys played that game? You guys played that game? Okay, good. One of these days I'm gonna really date myself. Okay. What disorders involve platelets? So we talked about some disorders that are involved in the red blood cells. Remember anemia, sickle cell anemia, white blood cell was like leukemia, SCIDS, mono. Here's some disorders of the platelets. Most of them are disorders where you don't have a lot of platelets, so you're not able to produce that protein that we were talking about. The first one, the thrombocytopenia, is a disorder in which the number of platelets is too low, so you just don't have a lot of platelets. So it's essentially like you just showed up to the soccer game with not enough players on the field, not enough being made in the bone marrow, or it's an increased breakdown outside the bone marrow. So it's either happening on the beginning of the process or the end. The thromboembolism is when there's a clot that forms and it breaks off and forms its site of origin and plugs another vessel. So imagine, remember we just saw that picture where all the platelets kind of congregated together. Imagine if that just kind of broke apart and like floated away and clogged something that it wasn't supposed to. That's kind of what that is. And then hemophilia is a genetic disorder, and this results in a deficiency of clotting factors, so that when a person damages a blood vessel, like you scrape your arm, you got a paper cut, something like that, they're unable to properly clot their blood, both internally, so like inside, and externally. So that one can be kind of drastic as well. The next slide is talking about donating blood. Okay, so maybe you've donated blood before, or you know somebody who has. So let's talk about what you need to know if you're interested in donating blood, or you have gone before. Donating blood is safe, and it's a sterile procedure. And you donate about a pint of blood. So this is different than just donating your plasma, because when you donate plasma, they give you your red blood cells back. When you donate blood, they take it all, right, and the kitchen sink. So you'll replace the plasma in a few hours and the cells in a few weeks. So although it seems kind of drastic to donate a pint of blood, which is about, you know, this much, your body regenerates those cells, okay? Most people may feel dizzy afterwards, so sitting down, eating a snack, and drinking some water, helping the nutrients and the oxygen, helping you rest, things like that. So those are some fun facts about donating blood. When you donate blood, they will test you for syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, and it can cause brain damage. So that's one that you don't really want to have for a long time. HIV antibodies, if you have the HIV antibodies, means that your body is fighting off HIV and hepatitis. And if any of them come back positive, you will be notified. So usually you have to like sign a waiver that's like, hey, I want to donate blood, I want to help people, but then they're like, okay, well just know we're going to test you for these things. But it also makes sense, right? Because if you want to donate blood, you don't want the person receiving that blood to receive any of these diseases that are transported through the blood, things like that. It says blood can help save many lives, especially like during the COVID times almost a year ago, there was a shortage of blood because people were just not leaving their house to go donate blood. It says you should not donate blood if you've ever had hepatitis or malaria, or have been treated for syphilis or gonorrhea within the past 12 months, or if you're at risk of having HIV or AIDS. And remember, we talked about how AIDS is related to HIV a little bit ago with those helper T cells. Okay, that's just a little information about donating blood. Let's talk about the ABO blood type. Okay, I've got about, well, we've got like 12 slides left. 2 or 3 of them are just full picture slides. All right, so we're just getting towards the end here, so stay with me, especially because we know what we're talking about here just a little bit, right? We talked about ABO blood typing in lab. We talked about the word antigen, antibody, blood transfusion, okay? The antigen is that foreign substance, often a polysaccharide or protein, that stimulates an immune response. So it's that protein on the outside of the red blood cell. The antibody is a protein that is made in response to an antigen in the body, which binds specifically to that antigen. So remember, you had those antibodies kind of floating around, antigen on the surface of that red blood cell. A blood transfusion is what happens when the transfer of blood from one individual goes to another individual. So if there was some sort of accident where someone was losing blood fairly quickly, or they lost too much blood, or even something like a C-section pregnancy sometimes, a blood transfusion may happen to help supplement that person who lost too much blood. It'd be like if you went and donated blood, but you donated more than a pint, essentially, right? You can walk away from donating blood, be like, yeah, I'm a little tired, I'm a little dizzy, but I'm fine, right? Somebody who would need a blood transfusion is not fine. Okay, so what determines the AB or O blood type is the presence or the absence of the two antigens. So you either have the A antigen, you have the B antigen, or you don't, or you have both. And the type of antibodies present. You either have A antibodies, B antibodies, or no antibodies, or both. And the antibodies are only present for those antigens lacking on the cells because these proteins recognize and bind the protein they are named after. So essentially, you can't have A antigens and A antibodies. That wouldn't work. Your A antibodies would attack your A antigens. They have to be opposite to work together. So let's talk about that. So here's some of the pictures. So I tried to draw this on the board in lab. You're going to also see that these pictures are way better than what I could draw. On the outside of this type A blood here, they have A antigens. Okay, they look, remember your red blood cell doesn't actually look like this, but just for conceptual ideas, those little blue bulbs, they look like lollipops or cotton candy. Those are the type A antigens. But your blood has anti-B antibodies. So that if you were to be given type B blood, these antibodies would fight it off. They'd be like, nope, not happening here. I've got A antigens, so you can't come near me with all that B blood. All right, so they have the opposite antibodies. The red blood cells have type A surface antigens, and plasma has anti-B antibodies. So it says, how can you remember what type of blood and what they mean? What each blood type means? The blood is named after the protein antigens that are present on the surface. So if you have A antigens, you have type A blood. If you have A and B antigens, you have type AB. The blood types only have antibodies to antigens that they do not have on the surface. Remember, they have to be opposite. So if you have AB antigens on the surface, you can't have A or B antibodies in your bloodstream, or else it would fight itself. So remember, it has to be opposite or it has to be nothing. Okay? Same thing with O. O doesn't have any antigens on the outside of it, but it does have antibodies in the plasma. So what can you say about someone with type AB blood? So let's talk about that. If somebody has type AB blood, all right, let's talk about their antigens first. Somebody want to tell me what type of antigens they have? You can just yell it out loud.
Would they have both?
They would have both. So they'd have like a lollipop one that they were showing on there, the blue one, but they'd also have like the branchy one. They have both A and B antigens. And then the antibodies, what type of antibodies would they have? None. Nope. None of those, or else we'd fight off what we actually have, but we don't want to do that. So that's what you can tell about somebody who has AB blood type. So this is a description of looking at all the different types, okay? Type A, type B, type AB, and type O, okay? So type AB, they have both of the antigens, none of the antibodies. Type O has none of the antigens, in both of the antibodies. See, this one's brown, that one's branched. Type B, B antigens, anti-A antibodies. Type A antigens, anti-B antibodies. The opposite. The next question is, how can we determine, we're sitting in the hospital, we're all going to turn into doctors and nurses after this, and you've got to decide, does this person need a blood transfusion, and if so, what can they have? Well, first, you have to consider the antigens found on the blood transfusion donor's red blood cells. So somebody donated some blood, we got to look at what this is. Okay, I'm holding on to the blood pint. Okay, so this donator has A antigens, all right? So the next part we say we consider the antibodies found in the recipient's blood. So the recipient, so the person who needs the transfusion, what type of antibodies do they have? Is this going to fight it off if I put it into their blood? And then if the antibodies in the recipient's blood can recognize the antigens on the donor's red blood cells, then the bloods will agglutine and clump and cause a rejection. So let me say that one more time. If the antibodies that's in the plasma and the recipient's blood can recognize the antigens on the surface, essentially they come together and form that clumping, which is what we did in lab to figure out what type of blood you had. We put the clumping serum on those different types of your blood, or the blood sample that you did, and if there was clumping, we knew that that's what type you had. Well, that clumping isn't normally good in your real life, in your body. And that's what would happen if you didn't find the perfect match for somebody who needed a blood transfusion. And what that would look like here, this is no agglutinin or no clumping. Agglutinin means clumping. So somebody who's type A donated their blood, all right? This person needs to receive that blood. The person who has type A has anti-B antibodies, and who received it, this person also had type A, so there was no binding. It was just normal. They received the blood and they were fine. But this one over here, if type A blood is trying to donate to somebody who's actually type B, or who has the type, or the anti-A antibodies, you can see that the antibodies attach to those antigens, and it forms this clumping. It's like, you're a foreign substance. My body doesn't like you. That's kind of what happens. All right, here's a few questions. I'm going to let you do these on your own on slide 38, okay, for your own studying, so that we don't have to go through them right now. So what about the RH factor? That's that positive and minus that we kept writing next to our slide, or our name. Like, I'm B positive, or I'm A negative, okay? Or I'm O positive, or O negative. So what is that RH factor, and why is it important? Well, it's often included when expressing a blood type by naming it positive or negative. And the people with the RH factor, if you have it, that's where you put the positive next to it. So if you're B positive, that means you're B and you have the RH factor. If you're B negative, you are B and you do not have the RH factor present. So think positive. When somebody is positive, they say yes, and that means you have it. The RH antibodies only develop in a person when they are exposed to the RH factor from another's blood, usually a fetus. So what's happening in this last bullet point is it's trying to explain how a fetus is attached to its biological mother, and how the blood is kind of being shared. Now, it is filtered through the placenta, but if the mom and baby have different RH factors, for example, like the baby is RH negative and the mother is RH positive, the antibodies may be exposed and cause some difficulties here. So here's another example of that. So during pregnancy under these conditions, so mom is RH negative, so this is another example here. Dad is RH positive, and the fetus is RH positive, which is possible with the parents above, okay, because the fetus could have gotten it from the biological father. In the case above, some RH blood can leak from the fetus to the mother, so this is dangerous for the mother during birth, causing the mother to make RH antibodies. It can be a problem if the mother later has a second fetus that is RH positive, because she now has an antibody that can leak across the placenta and attack the fetus. Okay, so usually, I forget what the medication is called. They give the medication to the mother who's going to have a baby if they have different Rh factors, and it kind of blocks it. It blocks it from getting into the mother's bloodstream because the mother just created antibodies to fight off the fetus's blood. But if they were to do it again, have another child, and that child was also Rh positive, the mother already has antibodies, so it's going to attack the fetus's blood. So this condition is known as hemolytic disease of the newborn, and it can lead to, I don't like that word, and death. Okay, this is how you can visualize it a little bit. So this is the blood of the mother. Okay, this is the fetus or the baby here. This first example is showing how the fetal Rh positive red blood cells leak from the fetus across the placenta and into the mother's bloodstream. So the mother's bloodstream starts to make antibodies to it. Then the mother forms anti-Rh antibodies that cross the placenta and attack the fetal Rh positive because they're kind of sharing blood essentially, right? Okay, so how can we prevent that? So women with Rh negative who are given an injection of anti-Rh antibodies no later than 72 hours after giving birth to an Rh positive baby. These antibodies attack the fetal red blood cells in the mother before the mother's immune system can make the antibodies. So the mother's body is not producing them. They're just going to give the antibodies to the mother so that if it happens again, the fetus baby does not, their blood does not attack the mother's. And then it says if it has to be repeated, then the Rh positive baby in her case has later pregnancies. So like it would have to do it again. Okay. I kind of went through that last part fast. Does anybody have any questions about that? The fetus and the baby and the Rh positive. Okay. So this is the last slide. So it says how many body systems cooperate to ensure homeostasis. Okay. This is a good exam question because it kind of talks a little bit about like multiple chapters at once, right? So it says how do heart and blood vessels, blood, work with other systems to maintain homeostasis? Not only does our blood help our cardiovascular system, meaning like oxygen to our extremities, carbon dioxide out, it helps our digestive system, right? Because blood vessels deliver nutrients to the digestive tract. Your blood is the transportation of those nutrients. It can be used in the urinary system because it helps excrete the waste from your kidneys and your liver cells, etc. It can go to your muscle cells to help with muscle contractions, like when you're working out and your muscles are contracting, or even as you walk out of the classroom today and your quadriceps are contracting as your hamstrings are flexing and vice versa as you're walking. Your blood system is helping maintain that homeostasis and vice versa. It helps the nervous system regulate the contraction of the heart and the constriction and dilation of blood vessels. Your endocrine system, which produces hormones. Respiratory system, which helps with the breathing. Your lymphatic system, which is fighting off infections. And your skeletal system and your rib cage that protects the heart, the red bone marrow. It produces red blood cells and bones and stores calcium deposits for blood clotting. So this is how your blood is affected in all of these different systems to help maintain that relatively constant internal temperature or homeostasis, not just temperature, but also other things like that. Okay, I've got one more thing for us to do. We're going to take a vote because let's see here.